Welcome back to another episode of the Resinator's Conquest podcast. This week I decided to delve into the rules, especially since the last Argument of King just released 2.0 rules. Let's get started with the round sequence. Now, I'm really excited to start getting down to these rules because there's been some changes, and I think there's been some really good changes in how some of these phases work. Each round of Conquest is broken down into 5 different phases. The reinforcement phase, the command phase, the supremacy phase, the action phase, and last, the victory phase. The first phase that each round starts off with is the reinforcement phase, and I like some of the changes that was made in 2.0. In the last Argument of Kings, the regiments are not deployed at the start of the game. They are held in the reinforcements, and they will come out later in the game as the game progresses. If you haven't done so already, what you're going to do is take the characters and add them to a legal regiment that they can join. And this is based on their type. A character that is an infantry type would have to join another infantry regiment. There are some exceptions to this rule, where the character can't join a regiment, and in the case like of the Old Dominion, the Keres and the Mori can't have any character join their regiment. On page 21 of the rulebook, you could find a nice little chart that shows you when the different regiment classes are going to come in per round. On round 1, you can designate one light regiment to be able to come in automatically, and then all the rest are going to add a die to the dice pool to roll for your reinforcement. If you had four light regiments, one would come in automatically, and then you would roll 3 dice. For each 4 or less, you can designate one of those light regiments to be able to come in on round 1. Then on round 2, you can designate either a light or a medium to come in automatically. Then you would roll 1 dice for each of the light regiments that haven't come in yet, and on a 4 or less, you can add 1 more of those light regiments. Then for mediums, let's just say you had 3 mediums, you'd roll 3 dice, and on a 4 or less, you can choose to bring in any number of those successes in. So if you got 3 successes, you can bring all 3 of those mediums in. If you only got 1, then you can only bring 1, and it's your choice. You can choose any of the 3. Then on round 3, lights come in automatically. Then you get to designate either a medium or a heavy to come in automatically. And then you would roll dice for all the remaining mediums that haven't come in. And on a 4 or less now, you'd select a medium regiment to come into play. For heavy regiments, you would need to roll 2 or less. Now on round 4, mediums come in automatically. Then you could designate 1 heavy regiment to be able to come out in automatically. And then if you still have regiments left over, you can go ahead and roll dice for them, and on a 2 or less, you can designate that number of successes to come in automatically. Not automatically. You can designate that many heavy regiments to come in. On round 5, everything comes in automatically. So everything's in, and everything should be in by round 5. A lot of times I feel like, especially with these rules that you're going to have 1 automatic each round, it's going to really help the game flow faster, and everyone's coming in a lot quicker. Alright, moving on to the command phase. This is a phase I really like because I feel like I try to outwit my opponent, but then I really don't do a good job of trying to figure out what they want to do. It always seems like there's a melee over here, and there's some shooting over here, and there's a big monster in the middle, and I'm like, they're gonna go for that melee burst, because if they don't get it, I'm gonna get it, and then, one's not gonna get a fight back, and no, they choose to do something way over here, and I'm like, what? And it just kind of, I don't know, that's the fun of it. So let's get into what the command phase is and what it's all about. In the command phase, what you're going to do is grab all the command cards that you have for the regiments that are coming into play or that have already been in play. Organize them in the order you want them to play. Make sure when you're looking at them, you put the first card that you want to play down first, then the second card on top of that, and the third card on top of that. That way, once you flip them over and have them face down, you'll draw the first card up first. A lot of people get this a little wrong, and they do it the opposite way, and then they flip over their cards, and then that's the last card on top the last regiment or character that they wanted to play is on the top instead of on bottom. Now, you can always look at the cards later in the round. You can't change the order of them, but you can always look at them and know what they are coming up. There's a lot of strategy in the command phase to where you could try to figure out what your opponent's wanting to do compared to what, you want to do first. Also, what I would recommend is looking at things like Bastion, especially that only last the round. So you really don't want to play a regiment that gains a Bastion on a draw event at the end of the round, especially if they're going to take a whole bunch of hits and they're sitting in the middle of the field. That's the command phase. Next, we're going to move on to the supremacy phase. There are two things that happen in the supremacy phase. You roll off to see who goes first, and you also can use supremacy abilities. Let's talk about the roll off first. It's pretty simple. Before you're going to roll your die, you're going to count the number of command cards you have in your command stack. If it is equal, you guys just roll off, and whoever has the lowest dice, that person goes first. If it's equal, you just keep re-rolling until somebody wins. Pretty simple. But now let's just say one person has less command cards than the other person. They have an advantage. So what they can do is add or subtract 1 from their die roll to equal either from 0 or up to 7. So basically you can kind of control if they go first or second. The other thing that happens in the supremacy phase is that characters can use their supremacy ability. Usually it's a once in a game ability unless the rule states otherwise. After you know who the first player is, that player can first choose if he's going to use a supremacy ability, and then the second player can choose if he's going to use a supremacy ability. If no supremacy abilities are chosen to be used, then you'll have to wait again to the next round. One last thing about those character supremacy abilities. They have to be on the battlefield before they can use them. Moving on to phase 4, the action phase. This is where all the carnage happens. In the action phase, we're going to do just that, take actions. I'm going to break down the action phase for you and list the actions and describe them in general, but I'm not going to go over them in detail because that's going to be a further video. Let's get started with the action phase. In the action phase, characters are going to take turns activating the top cards of their command stack, starting with the first player. Each card that activates has a sequence of basically 5 steps that you go through. The 5 steps are 1. Draw a command card. 2. Resolve draw events. 3. Take your first action. 4. Take your second action. 5. Deactivate your regiment. Starting with the first player, he would reveal the top card of his command stack and activate a regiment or character that correlates with that card. Some cards have draw events, and if it does, you're going to resolve that in the second step. Now, if you have more than one draw event, you're going to have to choose just one to activate. However, there are some rules that allow you to activate more than one draw event. Just make sure to check the rules. One last thing about the draw events, if they're not on the battlefield, draw events do not go off. So you can't have them in reserves, you draw the card, and have their ability go off when they're not even on the field. Step 3 and 4 are going to be taking your 2 actions. So let's go over the actions now. There are 2 different types of actions, out of combat actions and in combat actions. We're going to go over each one briefly. So the first thing you can do is march. Now this is the one action you can always do twice. So basically this is going to be where you're trying to move up the battlefield and maneuver into positions to either do volleys or make charges and do clashes later once you're in melee range. Charging. Now this is one of my favorites. The reason it's my favorite is because of impact attacks. I like impact attacks. I like these big, this is where you're going to have your cavalry crashing into those infantry, or you're going to have a monster just roaming and bashing into, brutes and cavalry and infantry and everything else because they're monsters, come on. Basically what you're going to do when you're charging is going to roll a die and add that to your move, and that's the distance you can go ahead and charge. We'll get into the details and the nitty-gritty of it later in a different video. The next out of combat action that you can take is to rally your troops. Basically, you're just going to boost the morale and take them from being in a broken state. Another out of combat action that you can take is to reform. And this is a very important one, I think. It helps you to be able to squeeze through your own troops, or to squeeze through narrow buildings, or to be able to reform to get more impact attacks when you're charging. So this is where you're going to change the formation of your ranks and files. It has to be a legal formation, but and the center of the regiment will still have to stay the same. But you can really change the shape of your regiment to fit it where you want it to go. Another out of combat action that you can take is to take aim. And this is a really important one if you have volley regiments. Because what this is going to do is increase your volley characteristic on your regiment by 1. So if you had a volley of 2, you take aim, and then they can now have a volley of 3. The last out of combat action you can take is to actually do the volley. So that's basically, shooting your arrows, shooting your crossbows, slings, whatever the barrage thing is. You're, basically throwing, flinging, shooting things, and that's a volley. And you're going to use your volley characteristic on your character profiles and regiment profiles. Moving on to the in-combat actions. The first in-combat action you can take is to clash. And this is basically just your melee. You're fighting, you're slashing, you're stabbing, and you're gonna go ahead and use your characteristic of the C on your regiments and characters profiles. The next in-combat action that you can take is to be able to do a combat rally. And this is if you're in combat, you're gonna basically rally from being broken, increasing the morale of your troops. Going along with the combat rally, what you can also do is a combat reform. I really like the combat reform because it allows you to maximize your attacks. I try to do combat reforms almost as often as I can, but there is some risk to doing combat reforms and you can lose wounds by doing them. The next in-combat action is something that I don't use that often because I play Old Dominion, and that is to inspire. So to inspire is to increase your clash value by 1. If you have a regiment that's already in melee, most of the time you're going to want to inspire first to increase your clash value by 1, and then actually clash. The last in-combat action you can take is to withdraw. Now, this is something that can be kind of hurtful, but at the same time, if you have a weak regiment that's either weak because it's been whittled down and it's dying, or because it was just a weak regiment to begin with, and they're stuck in melee with an enemy regiment that's now it's in your way, and you can't attack that enemy regiment because there's one stand in your way and you just don't have the room to fit in there based on where the terrain is. Maybe you do want to withdraw them and pull them away, and they may end up dying, but then you can get your stronger regiment into the charge and into the melee, into the fray, and doing damage. I had a game recently where that was the exact case, where I had a small area of terrain that I could fit through, and my cataphracti, one was left with 2 wounds left, but it was just enough in the way that I couldn't maneuver my bone golems through and 2 wide flank. So there's just some times when you do want to withdraw. Step 5 is to deactivate the regiment. And this is where you'll take your command card and place it next to the regiment that activated. There are some circumstances where either a character or regiment either just can't or doesn't want to move. And that's okay. You can choose to do that. That was the action phase. Moving on to the last phase, the victory phase. Alright, for the victory phase, this is where I win the game. Wait a minute. No, that's not really how it goes. Alright, the victory phase is just what it sounds like. You're going to see if you won. Either you're going to be adding up the points based on the scenario you are playing, or one of the players you're going to concede. There's lots of different scenarios and different ways you could be gaining points in each scenario, so I'm not going to go over those in detail. If no player has won, you'll go on to another round. That was the round sequence for Last Argument of King. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Next week, it'll be the First Blood round sequence.